Hi everyone, I hope home-based learning has been good for you so far. Okay, let's move on to the next part of our lesson. So in this picture here, you see Lord Louis Mountbatten, declaring the surrender of the Japanese, and formally we have the British military administration back in Singapore. So in school, we spoke about the different reactions people have, ranging from anger, shock, sadness, happiness, and all kinds of emotions. So you can tell that there were a lot of diverse opinions about the British returning back to Singapore. In this lesson, we are going to finally start chapter 6, and we're going to be focusing on what aspirations did the people have for Singapore after 1945. So when we say aspirations, what we really mean is their goals, their dreams, their aims. What did the people in Singapore want for themselves? Our lesson objective for today is twofold. Number one, we want to be able to describe the constitutional changes in Singapore after 1945, as well as the reasons why, internal and external development, that paved the way for these changes. The word "these" here refers to constitutional changes. I know that the words look rather big right now, so don't worry, we'll break it down as we go along the way. So first question, what is a constitution? A constitution is the set of laws used to govern a country. So for example, this is what Singapore's constitution looks like. If you want to read through, you can actually go to the site that you see at the top left-hand corner, and you can look through the constitution. So these are the laws which govern the whole of the country. If any of us does something against this law, we will be charged in court. So I bring you to one particular statement that you can see highlighted. It says here, this constitution is the supreme law of the Republic of Singapore. Every country has its own constitution, and in the case of Singapore, our constitution has its own unique set of laws. So when we say constitutional changes in 1945 and 1950s, what we are talking about is the change in the set of laws used to govern Singapore, and at that point of time we were under the British. So what exactly were the constitutional changes from 1946 to 1959? At this point I want to highlight you that the information I'm going to be going through is on textbook pages 59 to 63. So if you're not so sure, please feel free to refer back to your textbook. Under the British military administration, there are going to be two main constitutional changes. Number one, right to vote, for locals. You can see that this is something we did not have before 1945. And number two, control over government. It does not mean that we have full control, but we are going to have increasing amount of control over the government. So the first constitutional change is the right to vote. So what exactly happens? There's going to be three elections. The first one starting in 1948, second in 1955, and third in 1959. In 1948, they had limited elections, which means that only eligible voters or certain groups of people can vote for their representation in the Legislative Council. The Legislative Council is the one that's responsible for making laws. So essentially, this is the first time that locals have the right to decide who they want to represent them in the Legislative Council. I bring you to the picture on the right at this stage. So if you notice, in 1948, you have only about 14,000 people, because of the fact that it's a limited election. But by 1959, that number rises to 525,000. Partly because voting is compulsory, and also because they have now passed the Citizenship Ordinance Act. So you have a growing sense of identity as a Singaporean, whereas in the past, people still felt their homeland was their main country, right? So for example, the Chinese in Singapore, they would still by and large feel that they are Chinese. Their nationalistic pride is elsewhere, not in Singapore. But through these years, from 1948 to 1959, you can see a growing identity as a Singaporean and no more as just someone living in Singapore. Second one, control over government. What exactly happened? Okay, the Rendell Commission, which was led by British officials, recommended that limited self-government be given to Singapore in 1955. So what does limited self-government mean? As the word limited suggests, it is not full. The locals will have access or rights over certain parts of the government, but by and large, the more important parts of the government, such as, say, defense, will still be controlled by the British. So again here, you can see a growing presence of locals determining the future of Singapore. But at this stage, it's still very little. Okay, they are not in full control yet. You can't say that the government is Singaporean totally because the British are still controlling the more important small ministries within the government. Okay, nonetheless, you can see that the local members in the government is increasing from 6 members to 25 members, and that's quite a big jump. So at this stage here, let's take a short break. Okay, I want you to go to your skills package, page 12, and attempt the inference question that you see. Okay, so pause this video for a while, go and attempt the question. In the next slide, I will go through the answer with you. Okay, I would like to request that you try it out first before I give you a sample answer. I hope that you have attempted this inference, so now I'm going to go through it. Okay, starting with first thing, we always want to take note of what skill this question is asking us for. So in this case here, they are asking us for what can you infer. So I have to provide at least one paragraph with IEE, okay, the 3-sentence starters, the acronym for inference. And also take note that the question is asking about the Rendell Constitution. So I should not be focusing on other things like about the PAP or about the Labour Front. It should be about the Rendell Constitution. Otherwise, I would be considered to be not answering the question, and therefore I will end up getting an L1. So if you look at this picture here, okay, you see a man, Rendell, right, a British guy. Okay, he's holding a watering something, okay, and you see the words Constitution on it. So the Rendell Constitution essentially is pouring water on the mushrooms on the ground. And what you see labeled on the mushroom, okay, People's Action Party, the Alliance Party, Labour Front, Democratic Party, and Progressive Party, these mushrooms essentially represent the various political parties. So the idea here is that he is watering these mushrooms, and these mushrooms are about to grow. So from here, I can infer that the Rendell Constitution is the one that gave rise to the local parties in Singapore. Okay, so this is what a sample answer would look like. I can infer that the Rendell Constitution gave rise to local political parties. Okay, followed by my evidence. What I see must match what I think. Okay, the evidence from source A shows Rendell watering mushrooms with the words PAP, Labour Front on them. This means that the Rendell Constitution was the one that provided local political parties with the opportunity to grow and govern Singapore. Okay, I also want you to take note that my explanation is not exactly the same as my inference. The purpose of my explanation is to explain how my evidence led me to my inference. Okay, so check this against your answer. Also write it down with a green pen. Now, for the next part, we have gone through the first objective, which is what were the constitutional changes. Now our focus is on what were the reasons for these constitutional changes. Okay, at this stage, refer to textbook pages 64 to 67. Okay, and likewise clarify if you're not so sure. First, external developments. So we're going to talk about how external developments, things that were happening outside of Singapore, impacted Singapore such that constitutional changes were made. The first external development that was occurring was that countries under colonial rule were moving towards independence. Okay, so when we talk about colonial rule, we are talking about being ruled by somebody else, right? In this case, most of the colonial rulers, they were Europeans. Okay, you had your British, you had your Dutch, you had your French, you also had Americans ruling certain countries in Asia. So in the 1945 and onwards, there were a lot of countries within Asia that were moving towards independence. They realized they could no longer trust the colonial powers because in some countries, okay, when the Japanese invaded their countries, the colonial powers did not put in their best effort to fight against the Japanese because to them, the war in Europe was more important. So in these countries, they felt the betrayal of the colonial powers, and therefore when the colonial powers came back after the Japanese occupation, the locals were not willing to accept them anymore. There was increasing resistance towards these colonial powers in general. Okay, so one of the countries that will fight back against the British colonial powers will be India. Not that they were controlled by the Japanese, but they were controlled by the British for a very long period of time and they experienced a lot of discrimination. So they started fighting for their rights and fighting for independence. You also have Vietnam, which was controlled by the French. Okay, they felt very betrayed by the French who left them during the Japanese occupation. And you also have Indonesia, which was ruled by the Dutch. So if you notice something, all these countries, which continent are they in? They are all in Asia. So you think about it, right? If I am located right next to Vietnam, say I'm Cambodia or Thailand, and I see Vietnam fighting back against the French, and in fact, they were quite successful in their first few runs, right? If you see them being quite successful, what that tells me, if I'm a Cambodian or if I'm a Thai, is that I too can fight against the colonial powers. So there was this general idea that, we can fight for our rights and we can win the colonial powers and we should have our own independence and no longer be exploited by these colonial powers. So these things, these external developments were already going around Asia and the British started getting very, very scared because they were afraid that countries like Singapore would also start expecting independence and fighting against the British. The rise of communism is the second external development that we'll be talking about. Okay, bear with me, it's quite a complex idea, but I'll try to simplify it to the best of my abilities. So communism is a theory that was developed by Karl Marx. Okay, the guy you see on the left, he's a German. He came out with this idea because he was against capitalism. Capitalism is another theory, another ideology, which basically says that if you are the owner of a factory, okay, you get to keep the profits because it's your factory, right? So a country that is capitalist today, for example, will be the USA. Okay, if you own a factory that produces machines, you get to keep the profit and your workers will be paid a certain amount, not necessarily fairly, because normally if you realize the people who work in industries are low wage workers. So what happens in a capitalist society really is that the owner becomes very rich because he's making a lot of profits, he's taking home all his profits. On the other hand, the worker, the low wage worker, is going to be exploited. He's going to be made use of to work for many, many hours, but he's not going to be given the fair pay. So what happens in a capitalist society is that the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. Okay, and Karl Marx was against this. He felt that capitalism was exploiting the workers, and therefore he came up with this idea of communism. So communism, the root word is communal, common, okay, which means that everybody, which propagates the idea that there should be equality among society. There should not be a situation where the rich are extremely rich and the poor are extremely poor. So how does he go about this? How does communism work? I'll give you a simple idea of a cow, a state, and milk here. Okay, for example, in this picture that you see, there are two cows. Okay, in a capitalist society, whatever milk this cow gives belongs to the individual, right? He gets to keep all the milk and nobody is going to take that away from him. And because of that, he's going to have more milk than somebody else who's just working for him, right? So in a communist society, things change. The state takes control of the cows. And what the state does is they try to give the milk back to the people equally. So theoretically, there should be equality on the ground in terms of who has how much milk. Okay, so communism here, the cows here represent the means of production. Okay, if I have a factory in a capitalist society, the owner gets to keep the profits. But in a communist society, the factory will be owned by the state, and the state will decide how much each worker should be paid or how much money, how much income each person is going to get. Okay? Why were they so scared? China became communist in 1949 and the British were very, very worried that the Chinese immigrants in Malaya and Singapore would be influenced by a communist China. Okay, furthermore, the Malayan Communist Party in Singapore already wanted an end to British rule. They already were attacking rubber plantations and were spreading their influence by stirring ill feelings towards the British. So the communist the increasing presence of communism in other countries, external countries such as China, Russia, and even some countries like Vietnam were being threatened by communism. Okay, all these growth of communism started worrying the British and their control over Singapore. They were worried that the parties in Singapore, the people in Singapore, will become influenced by the communists and threaten the control the British had over Singapore. Okay, so why did they make all these constitutional changes? Why is it so bad if other countries are moving towards independence? Why is it so bad that if communism is becoming a greater power? Okay, it's bad because it undermines British control in Singapore. And although they were not fully interested in Singapore, it was still a good land for them to have. Okay, and they knew that they still wanted Singapore. They didn't want to lose the whole of Singapore, considering all these other things are going on around the world. So they carried out the constitutional changes by giving them the right to vote and increasing control over Singapore to gain back some form of support. Okay, they needed the locals to believe and keep supporting the British so that they can continue their reign in Singapore. Okay, next, internal developments. So again, the question here is, how did internal developments lead to the constitutional changes in Singapore? So when we talk about internal, we are talking about things that are happening inside of Singapore. Okay, the first thing that happens is the rise of political consciousness. Okay, to be conscious means to be awake, right? You're not in a state of comatose, you're awake, you're aware. Okay, they become more politically aware about what is going on around the world. So a lot of them started questioning British superiority. Okay, and there were more locally born people, there were more people who were interested in how Singapore was to be ruled. So they started questioning the British. And the more they questioned, okay, the more people started to resist the British as well. So they decided to make constitutional changes because they needed support. You see, if I start to question you on what you've been doing, but you continue doing things the same way that you have, it's going to be a clash. If the British say I'm going to be in full control, but people on the ground want power, they want to be represented, then there's just going to be growing hatred towards the British. So what the British do is they give and take a bit. So they say, I can allow you the right to vote. However, I'm still in power. Technically, I determine when the elections occur. And the people that you choose in power, they still serve me. So the British are still in control, just that they are giving away some autonomy, some rights to the people on the ground. With that, we have come to the end of this lesson. So we have fulfilled the two main lesson objectives. Okay, number one, to be able to describe the constitutional changes, you should be able to tell me what are those two things. Okay, number one, the right to vote. And number two, control over government. Okay, and number two, the reasons why internal and external developments that pave the way for these changes. So when we talk about internal, we are talking about the rise of political consciousness. And when we talk about external, we are talking about the rise of communism as well as countries becoming independent. If you have questions, okay, feel free to ask us. I know this is quite difficult to comprehend at this stage. So do rewatch the video if you're confused or just ask us. Okay, bye-bye.